Hey, welcome to the GP Podcast. This year at Grace Point, we're focusing on one thing, becoming more like Christ by really leaning into his character. Each month, our pastors have been discussing a different attribute of who Christ is and teaching us how to grow that same attribute in our own lives. But here's the thing, not everything makes it into those final sermons. And that is where this podcast called Side Notes comes in. Each month, Pastors Dan Painter and Jared Seeland will join us and share some of their stories and thoughts and interesting tidbits that didn't quite make it to the stage. It could be some of their personal experiences as well, or challenges that they've seen pop up in culture, or just extra notes from their prep. Think of it as the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor. Still really good, just, not part of the final message. So let's jump in and chat about last month's theme. Plus, of course, here's some of the side notes from our pastors. All right, welcome back to the GP Podcast. As you heard in the intro, this is going to be a little bit of a different feel from what we did last year. Last year, we looked at the engagement track, and each part of those engagement track sections were parts of your life that you could grow. If you didn't get a chance to listen to any of them, you should go back. You should check them out. It involves a lot of growth options for all of us. We're always growing in the Christian faith, right? But this year, we're going to be, as you heard in the intro, we're going to be talking about different attributes of Christ. And it's always going to be a month behind what we discussed last month. And last month was the topic of love, loving like Christ. And before we get too much further into it, let's go ahead and introduce Jared and Dan Painter. And because this is the first one, I think it's important that you guys explain a little bit of how you got to Grace Point, right? Dan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I can start. I was going to let Jared go first. Jared, do you want to go first?
No, I don't. I don't want to.
Fine, I'll go first.
Absolutely,
Right,
after
you. Yeah, so I got to Grace Point because I came out from upstate. I grew up in upstate New York, came out here for school. I went to Moody Bible Institute. And on my floor at the school, there are actually a couple of guys from Grace Point. Actually, at that time, it was Naperville Bible Church, who... there were guys that actually grew up going to Naperville Bible Church, to Grace Point.
Nice.
And then there were other guys that were serving as a part of the ministry coming out from Chicago and serving at the church. And they invited me to come out and to serve as a part of the junior high ministry at that time.
Cool.
This is back in 98, which is crazy.
Whoa.
It's been a long time ago, back in the 1900s. And so I started coming out here just as a volunteer, and it's 25 years later, which is crazy to think about in terms of when I started volunteering. And
Sure.
Been a great journey in terms of the ways that God has taught me and humbled me over the years and grown me and shaped me. I met my wife in the process. We've been married 23 years this June. We've got 4 boys. Which then they're just such great guys. I'm so thankful for them, and thankful for how God has used them to also humble me and teach me along the way. And I've gotten to serve throughout Grace Point over the years. I mean, in so many from youth. I didn't ever serve in children's ministry.
Worship team for a while
worship
too, right? Yeah.
For a while. I was associate pastor. I was campus pastor here, campus pastor Plainfield, and now lead pastor here, which is it's such a privilege. I was just talking to some new people this last week about just the fact that they feel like this is home for them, and that's exactly how I feel about Grace Point. It's just been a place coming from New York with the plan of originally just going back home. Grace Point has been a home for me, and everywhere I go, everywhere that Grace Point is connected, it is a community that loves Jesus, wants to grow and reflect Jesus, and I just don't think there's a better community to be a part of. It's just been a huge blessing.
For someone from New York, I don't hear a lot of New York accent.
Yeah,
I mean, you've been here obviously
Upstate.
years.
I grew up in upstate on the border of Vermont, where our language and our accents are pure. And,
Fair enough. I won't argue that one.
we don't get coffee or, so yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Jared, what about you?
Yeah, weirdly enough, my whole family is from New Jersey, so we all talk with the when I introduce myself to people,
Premise
I call
mule.
myself Jared because
Jared.
that's how you say it, in New Jerseyan.
Jersey, that makes sense
yeah.
to me now.
Yeah, okay, all right, guy. Let's go Giants. Here we go. Yeah. So my family's from Jersey, but I moved out here with my family. I mean, when I was just a very little kid. Actually, I think in 1998 is when we moved here.
Okay.
So wild.
Wow.
I was
You were born by that
3
point.
years old. Yeah, man, 2 journeys. Well, yeah. So I grew up in Plainfield, Illinois, which is where our Plainfield campus is located, obviously. And I grew up going to a local church in the area. And then when I graduated high school, I wanted to get out of Illinois quickly, and I didn't want to go to do more college, and so I ended up just, finding the quickest way out and enlisting in the Marine Corps, which today is November 11th. Yesterday was the Marine Corps birthday.
Wow.
So Semper Fidelis, anybody listening. I enlisted in the Marine Corps and then came back to go to college locally, went to North Central, and then started leading Young Life as a volunteer through my college days. And eventually, when I graduated college, I was invited to take the area director position for Plainfield Young Life, which initially I turned down because I said, no, I'm getting out of Illinois. This is my plan. But the guy said, pray about it. And, dangerous response. So I prayed about it and ended up taking the Young Life position, served for 2 years in local Plainfield high schools. And as part of that job, I got to network with a lot of local churches. Any students that came to Young Life that did go to church already, I would always invite myself to attend their church with them and then invite other students with us. So that was kind of one of the pieces of our discipleship model that I just thought was really important. 1 year, I met a couple of freshmen who said that they were from Grace Point Church. And so I said, okay, well, hey, I'd love to come to church with you and maybe invite out a couple of other kids. So they said, absolutely, let's do it. So I went out there and just heard a couple of things. I heard really authentic worship. I saw a passion for the word of God that was being preached. And I saw it more clearly, I think, at Grace Point than I had in a long time. And it was just really refreshing for my soul as somebody in leadership to feel so fed and well poured into. On top of that, after the service, I got to meet the campus pastor at the time, who was none other than Dan Painter. And he said, I told him a little bit about what I did and what I was doing, and he offered to just be a presence in my life while I was serving in ministry. And a couple of months later, not even a year after that meeting, we started talking about an opening that had come up at Grace Point, and he kind of invited me to go through the process of the interviews and consider taking the position. And I told him, no, absolutely not. I'm getting out of Illinois. That's true. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sticking around for this. But he hit me with that, that request to pray for it or to pray about it. And I did, and the Lord just put it on my heart that this is a passion that He was waking up in me, was to serve the local church. So I came on as the associate pastor, had a couple of different roles in the interim, and then just recently, over the summer, became the campus pastor in Plainfield.
I have to say, though, 2 things. One, when Jared came on staff his first day, I purchased a coffee mug for him with the state of Illinois on it, and it said home in it. I was like,
I'm never getting out of here.
You're never leaving. Yeah. But the second thing is, as I got to know Jared, I just saw in him, there was something in him that was, yes, I saw his love for youth and students, but I also really believed as I got to know him, that I could see him doing exactly what he's doing now as a campus pastor. I saw those things in him, the kind of pieces of character and gifting. And I think those things are connected to calling, that I'm so psyched to have him as serving as campus pastor in Plainfield. I think he's doing a great job, and really think that he is, God's right man at the right time. So super thankful. And
I appreciate that.
It's getting warm in
Wish you
here.
would say that when the microphones were off.
No, I didn't mean a word of the last one. Are we not playing 2 truths and a lie?
Oh man, let's talk about love.
Yes. So let's talk about love.
Yeah, we should. No, we should now. Yeah.
LOVE.
Oh man.
So okay. So we have a picture of where you guys came from. Let's talk about last month. First question here: what part of that theme, love, last month really resonated with you personally?
Yeah, I think for me, writing an entire sermon series on love was fascinating and challenging in some really cool ways because, Dan, we've talked about this, but it's not uncommon to have a series, say, on the fruits of the Spirit, where you are going through each topic and you're doing one sermon on each of these different topics, you know? It's an entirely different thing to have one facet of Jesus's character that you just get to mine and open up and see throughout these different phases of his life and these different narrative passages. And it's beautiful and exciting to just really dig into what Jesus stood for. And I think what made this so important is that we have this equation that the Bible gives us really clearly, and that is that in 1 John we're told that God is love, and then we're also told that Jesus is God in John 1:1, and therefore Jesus is love. So if we're going to talk about the character of Jesus and focusing on him, I think it's appropriate, and I don't even know if it's an option to just be mandated to start with the love of Jesus. Now,
which is interesting because the title was Essentials.
Yeah,
It is.
Yeah, it's totally
like Jesus.
Yeah,
absolutely the essential. I mean, you really, it's interesting. One of the things that stood out to me is just you've got love as a part of the fruit of the Spirit, right? It's the first fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience. And so it is one among many, but there's also this sense that love is the fundamental, foundational one that the others really grow out of in a lot of ways. Because if you go to 1 Corinthians 13, right, love is patient, love is kind, and so there is this sense that love it leads to the expression of all of the other fruit of the Spirit, and it really is that kind of essential characteristic of God and of Jesus, and it is meant to be, therefore, I think, the fundamental, essential character of us as Christians, right? So John 13, this is how the world will know that you're my disciples, that you love one another. And it's qualified by the verse before it that says that we are to love as we have been loved as he loved us. And so, man, if you're going to really think about what it means to be a Christian and what the world should see in us as Christians, they should be seeing Jesus in us, and the thing that they should see, I think most of all, according to Jesus himself, is that they should see us loving in the way that he loves. Right? Jesus shows us who the Father is by his love. Right? This is who the Father is, and now we're to be showing who Jesus is. And Jesus showed us that by the way that he loves, and so now we're to be showing who Jesus is by the way that we love. So it's such a critical piece. And by the way, I love the fact that we're coming back to this. I mean, I know, right, we're a month later, and this month we're focused on wisdom, but I love that we're coming back because, you know, all of these characteristics, love especially, but all of them are things that we have to keep coming back to, and we have to keep looking in the mirror of Christ and therefore, you know, looking in the mirror to see ourselves and where we don't measure up. We have to keep coming back, especially to love and going, that isn't me. I'm not there yet. And I've got a lot of growing left to do, and it'll be my whole lifetime. And so I'm really glad that we're doing this podcast, and I'm glad we're coming back in time to look at a month later and go, okay, don't forget. I need to think about this. I need to keep remembering as I move on. I'm not leaving things behind.
Right.
Well, what would make the pot spicier, so to speak? What are those parts of the sermons that you guys preach that you would say, I wish I could have put that in there, that would have grown our knowledge of God's love?
I think I alluded to it throughout the series, and definitely zoomed in a bit throughout this series. But I do think it could have been great to just, and this is like an hour-long presentation or conversation, but just to juxtapose the way that the world loves, the way that the world defines love with the way that Jesus does. And I think that as we mind each of these, love serves, love comforts, love confronts, in each of those different focuses, we see the difference. But just to really pull in kind of what Augustine would call a cultural critique, and to say, this is the key difference between the way that the world views love and the way that Jesus views love. Because, I mean, especially in our social climate right now, many people would look at Christians who are just trying to live in an orthodox way with the Bible. I mean, not as a denomination, but in like the right belief sense that we're reading and trusting the Bible and living in that way. And they would say, well, just doing that is not loving, because you're making moral judgments on a certain lifestyle versus another. And I think it would have just been really cool to mine, and this is, again, why we have this conversation. That's why it's helpful. But just to talk through the fact that, like, loving the way Jesus loved people means that you will the best for their lives, and the best for their lives is always going to be God's will for their lives. And then you look at the world's interpretation of love, and the world says you love people by just encouraging them to do whatever they want to do. Not want to do at depth, but rather those high level wants of that impulsive desire. And if we say that that's not God's best, then it's unloving. Whereas,
if you love me, you will support what I need and what I want.
Yeah, no matter the impulse, no matter the self-destructive behavior, like we really frown upon making value or moral judgments like that. But the way of Jesus, I loved this in Love Confronts, because some of his most intense words were delivered to the religious leaders. And sometimes our world makes an exception in this rule for correcting religious figures, but Jesus does something really cool in that he confronts them very boldly and clearly, and says, this isn't the will that God has for you as leaders. You're loading burdens on people that you yourself don't carry. You're making this presentation of holiness, but really on the inside, you are dead. You're an unmarked grave. So not only are you dead inside, but you're also causing other people to be dead just by and unclean by stepping on this grave. So I just think that juxtaposition is so important to really nail down, especially as we tell people to become more loving.
That was big for me too. The concept that love confronts, and having to actually stand up and say, no, you know what, by showing you that this is wrong in your life, or at least saying, can you think about this? I think this is something you need to think about. That's hard to do.
I'd say one of the pieces that I think is really connected to that, that's really significant, is that the idea that love serves is that it is seeing the need in the people around us, and then moving to meet that need in the best way possible. And the thing about the accounts in the Gospels is you have two groups of people primarily that are separated by moralistic lifestyle. So you've got the sinners, the tax collectors, that group, the prostitutes, the drunks. You've got that side, which are the immoral people, and then you've got the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and on one side you have when you're looking at those the sinners. When we did our message on love comforts, is that we were looking at the woman at the well who's living in a very broken lifestyle, and you've got to go and the way that you serve that person is that you comfort them. And then on the other side, it was the Pharisee, and that there's times there's people that are arrogant and prideful, and they need to be confronted with the truth. And one of the things that I remember is that, and I think it's important for us to remember this, is that it is possible to be a broken Pharisee and need comfort with the gospel, with the comfort of the gospel. And it is possible to be a very arrogant tax collector, and to need to be confronted with the truth. And part of that, and I didn't talk about that because it's just like you just can't get to everything, right?
Sure, right. Yeah.
But the way of love is a selfless lifestyle that is other focused, right? Because of the way that we've been loved. The opposite of that lifestyle isn't just the immoral person or the Pharisee. They're both they both represent unique expressions, really, of the same problem, which is a life of sin, that life rooted in self-centeredness because of sin, that is driven by both pride and fear. And so I think part of the thing we always need to be challenging ourselves with is to make sure that we're using our brain when we're trying to love the people around us. So not every person, like I said, not every person who's living kind of that immoral lifestyle just needs that comfort of the gospel, because some of them are very comfortable in their immorality, and if you go to them and you're like, hey, listen, God loves you, they're going, I agree. God loves me, and he just wants me to be happy. And if you go to some certain, legalists, there's legalists that are just so broken because they're trying to measure up to the standard that they know they can't, and they don't have hope. And if you come to them and you beat them over the head with the law, they're like, I know, what hope is there, right? And so there is this sense that, God is always calling us into this dependent relationship where we need to be thinking and engaged in praying for God to give us the wisdom. I mean, we're looking at wisdom this month, but praying for God to give us the ability to see who it is that we're really talking to in a relational sense, to engage in relationship, to get to know where people are, and in that way to understand the need that they have, so that we can really love them well. And we just need to be careful not to assume what people actually need.
That was a wild paradigm shift. I think that's because so many times we look at the Pharisees and we say, oh, their chief sin was being religious, or some formulation of that. And no, they were just arrogant, and their generation had conditioned sinners to be shameful. Meanwhile, we're living in a generation where we've spent a century conditioning people to not be ashamed of any of their sin and brokenness. So, man, that's super insightful, and also kind of goes back to the woman at the well, John 4, right? And then in John 3, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, who is that kind of humbled religious leader. And he's saying, I'm broken. I don't understand. Please help me. And he's genuinely asking. And Jesus gives him some stern truth, and yet delivered with so much comfort. And that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time that we live in as we're kind of looking at our cultural, the cultural dynamics around us, and the fact that there is so much immoral pride. I just heard an article yesterday, because when we talk about the culture's perspectives on love, it is very self-centered, and it's very self-serving, and it's very consumeristic. So I love you as long as you satisfy me, and as long as you make me happy, and as long as you kind of affirm my way of life. And this may go off the rails a little bit here, so I gotta be careful, because it was a crazy article, and I think it was in the New York Times. I can't remember,
but
it was
it out if it's crazy.
Yeah.
Just go for it. Let's see what happens.
So the article was about a form of singleness that embraces just kind of free immorality, free sex, basically, with everybody around you, and celebrating this, I really have found, these people are talking about how they've really finally found the kind of relationships that fulfill and satisfy them. And I saw one post, in all the responses, I saw one post of somebody going, wait a minute, this isn't God's design. And everybody jumped on them and was just yeah, you know what, that might be fine for you, but that isn't fine for us. And what you really need to do is, go live your thing, but we're going to live our things. And this is really fulfilling and satisfying, and going, man, this is that embrace of we have defined what love is. We have defined the way that it's lived out, and it is fulfilling. And we know ultimately very temporarily fulfilling, and in a way where they have to keep going from one person to the next person, the next person, the next person. But it's giving them a sense of relationship, and I'm putting that in quotes, without commitment, or real responsibility or accountability, and but just with an attitude of absolute truth. This is the way, and it is right. And you're going, on what basis? And so anyways, just there's just such a pride in all of it that says we can do what we want, and it is right, and don't question us.
How would you help somebody understand how to talk to somebody that believes that?
It's a great question, because we also don't want to advocate for standing on a street corner with a sign and yelling at people.
I did that yesterday.
That was you in downtown Naperville.
That was,
okay,
yeah. I
all
feel
right,
bad
yeah.
now. Thanks.
Shoot.
I'll
All right,
rephrase.
well,
I'll rephrase.
I guess it was, correction, speaking the truth in love. Thanks, Jared.
Oh man, good. Super important question, and I'd say it starts with what we talked about in the last week of our series, and I think you kind of covered it too in the first week of wisdom. But just it comes to a loving vision for people, and Jesus had this incisive vision where he could look at people and tell
right down
where,
to the,
the people that there's a lot of fascinating articles on this about our generation's sort of redefinition of relationship. And I was reading an article in, I think it was an offshoot of The Economist, but it was called Love Between the Spreadsheets, and it was talking about a trend in New York of people that were going through these dating apps and then starting spreadsheets, and for each person they met, they would score them in all these different categories. Wow. And what they found was this one person that they were just following pretty closely, they found that they were just so dissatisfied with themselves because they were thinking like, okay, what do I deserve? And am I good enough to be committed to? And I think that's the other half. But I think with any of those situations, Dan, like you were talking about, anytime that there's sin, it will lead to existential brokenness that may not present itself on the surface. But when we develop this relationship, and I think Jesus did relationships really well with people. I mean, he was invited over to the Pharisees' home, right? And that's what started the confrontation. And he spent time with people. And there must have been something about the way that Jesus confronted brokenness that said, I see what's making you sad. I see what's causing you this existential dread that you're feeling. And let me just free you of it. Again, we're not screaming you're going to hell, and we're not, but more kind of saying like, going back to me loving you means that I will God's best for you. And right now I see that you're just not living in God's best. So can I like call you into that and maybe help you process, because most people know where their brokenness is coming from. So just being a voice to help them process and redirecting to scripture every chance you get. And that's what it's beautiful too about this year of focus is coming so close to the biographical narratives of Jesus gives us so much conversational material with people to say, oh man, like your situation reminds me so much of this moment where Jesus found this woman who was searching for satisfaction everywhere except for the well of eternal water. Pulling that, and it flows like conversationally. It's so much better than you would think if you know these stories well from scripture, and if you can bring them into conversation.
One of the big pieces for having conversations with people about these things, I think there's a great conversation to be had through the lens of the book of Ecclesiastes, where you've got Solomon who is trying to find that sense of meaning in life under the sun, is the phrase that he uses. And under the sun means as if there is nothing above the sun. So which is a lot of the way that people are living their lives, right? We are living as if there is nothing. Whether or not we think there might be, we're living as if there's nothing over the sun. This is it. All that there is the visible world. And if all there is the visible world, well, you have all of these longings and cravings that you're chasing after, right? Yep. And that you're trying to satisfy. And his whole premise is it's a chasing after the wind. So every time you grab a hold of it, if you open your hand, there's nothing there. Yeah. You're grasping after something that you can't really hold on to. And so he tries everything. Anything, and by the way, he had so much wealth that he could try everything, right? He had so much power, he could try everything, and he tried everything. I mean, our culture is, in a lot of ways, what I would call Ecclesiastes on steroids. And I say it's on steroids because I think culture has, with our connectivity, our access to everything, the touch of a button, we've got computers in our pockets, everything is faster. Everything is constantly, we have the ability to move from one thing to the next thing, So this thing isn't working, so I'll try the next thing. And that thing's not working, and so I'll jump to the next thing. I mean, for all the power that Solomon had, we have unbelievable power to jump from thing to thing to thing. Yeah. And what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to satisfy these longings that have been created because Ecclesiastes 3, eternity has been written on our hearts, and the only thing that is eternal is God Himself, and so we were created with this need for satisfaction at the core of our souls, core of our being, that only God can satisfy. And anytime you try to satisfy what God was meant to satisfy with something other than God, the end result is it leaves you empty. It is, God talks about it through the prophet Jeremiah, like using broken cisterns, like using a cup with a hole in the bottom of it. You pour the water in and it just keeps running out. The woman at the well, there's just such power in that story, in having these conversations, because this is the thought that struck me. There was like one piece that, there's a couple pieces that I thought was just so important, but this piece was so powerful to me. So Jesus is coming to this well where this woman is, of course, coming to get water, because the thing about water is, you drink water, it satisfies your thirst, but it only satisfies it temporarily. Like, nothing shocking in that I've just said. But think about every physical thing that you try to use to satisfy. You get hungry, you eat. What has to happen? You have to eat again.
Yep.
And you have to keep eating, and you have to keep eating, you have to keep eating, and you get tired, you sleep. And then you get up and you hopefully feel at least somewhat rested, and you do the next day. And what do you have to do? You got to keep sleeping. You got to keep sleeping. Yeah. Anything that you use physically to try to satisfy the longings of your physical being, it only satisfies you temporarily. Here's the crazy part, is that if what we're doing is we're trying to satisfy the spiritual longings of our lives with physical things. Yeah. Here's the thing. If the physical things can only satisfy our physical body temporarily, why would we think that those physical things would solve the problem the longings that we have spiritually permanently? Yeah. Yep. So we have to keep coming back to these wells. We have to keep coming back and coming back. So when you go back to that story of that article of those people who, they've got like 10 relationships of people that they're sleeping with, and none of them are they really committed to. And you're going, okay, why is that? Why you need that many? Yeah. Why? Because you aren't satisfied. Yeah. Because you're trying to use that to fulfill this longing that only God can satisfy you with. And so just be, I think this opens up a conversation to go, let's just be really honest. Are you actually really satisfied by what you're doing? And we know the answer ultimately is no. It's not going to satisfy me permanently. It will keep running out. Yeah. And I'll have to keep chasing and keep chasing and keep chasing. And so then that opens up the conversation. Okay, so then what satisfies? Is there actually a satisfaction? Is there something that can fulfill you or not?
So lovingly asking those questions in the context of their lives. So what I'm hearing so far is the loving them to get to know them, loving them to understand their situation, and then loving them to be able to confront them as well. Yeah. Yeah. And being able to put all three of those things together, hopefully we'll be able to also welcome your thoughts and your love into their life, be able to minister them in some way. I think prayer is involved in that, obviously. Totally. And God's wisdom is what we're talking about this month. I keep coming back to this month's theme too, but because it's all tied together in God's character ultimately, right? But
totally.
There's been this thought that's like at the edge of my mind. As you were, Jared, as you were talking, I was like, oh, this is a really important thought. And then I keep losing it and it keeps coming back.
Say it quick.
And it came back. I almost lost it again just in the middle of telling you all of this. But one of the thoughts that I had is in terms of this longing and the insecurity, you talked about I think you mentioned an article where the person, the spreadsheet piece. Yeah. They're measuring all of these other people, but then they're dissatisfied with themselves.
Totally.
One of the ways that we find ourselves empty is when I am doing that. There is this sense where I come under the same judgment by which I am judging others in my own heart. So if I'm measuring you,
dude,
right? If I'm measuring you, now I start going, wait a minute, if I'm doing that to you, who's doing that to me?
Right.
And even if nobody else is doing it to me, I end up doing it to myself and feeling like I don't measure up because now I've got a standard for you that internally it has to be applied to myself, unless I'm just a complete narcissist, which is possible.
Right.
But like, if I'm really honest,
Yeah.
if I'm applying that to you, then it roundabout has to get applied to me.
Right.
And then there's this sense that I don't measure up to that standard by which I'm demanding that you measure up. And so now not only
a mad circle.
am I dissatisfied with you, now I'm dissatisfied with myself, and I've got all this dissatisfaction that I'm trying to meet. And that's where you get to go, well, guess what? There is someone who actually meets that. And it isn't you, and it isn't another human, another person, a woman, a man, a relationship, a job, money, whatever it is. It's none of that. It is God himself who sent his son into this world. So that, and we'll talk about joy later on, but so that we might have true joy, but a joy that is found in relationship with him, because we find the real satisfaction in the longing of our souls. So,
man, absolutely. That pulls in the beauty of freedom that Christians can find just by practicing loving like Jesus. Because I think it's true that we, in the article, they literally have a spreadsheet for all these different people. But I think it's a trap of the human heart to go into every room and evaluate people and start to wonder, okay, how do I stack up against all these people? How am I as smart as these people? Am I as good looking as these people? Whatever it is.
That's half of social media today. Is comparing your life to others.
Talk about being conditioned for it. We are so wired for comparison, and that's probably part of the formula of why social media is so successful. But to step out of that system of thinking is when a Christian chooses to love the way that Jesus loved people, they are rebelling and shattering that system, because they're saying, I'm not going into a room and evaluating, I'm going into a room and I'm valuing. So it's something different. I'm seeing the image of God in all these people, and what you do is just like you said, Dan. Like, you're sending a message to yourself when you go into a room and evaluate. You're saying, "I'm being evaluated." But when you go into a room and you say, "These are all beautiful images of God, and I can't wait to love them sacrificially," and to step out in action on those, you're also conditioning yourself to remember the gospel, to remember that you are an image of God, and that people are seeing you. Especially in a community of Christians, that people are seeing the image of God in you, and they're seeing the best in you, and that's, one of the beautiful solutions to insecurity in our day is just to start loving people the way that Jesus loved people.
And to do that on the basis of knowing that that's how I am loved.
Exactly.
Right? That's just the key of all of this, is going, okay, it's not I love in order to get the love, right? This is the amazing truth of the gospel is, look, every other religion tells you that you love in order to get love. And the problem with that is that you can't really love out of that. You're really actually being self-centered, because you're using people. I'm serving in order to try to do enough in order to get loved, right? And so now I'm not really loving people, I'm loving myself, right? There's that whole paradigm of I'm serving, but I'm not really serving you, I'm serving myself, that whole,
And that can be used with confrontation too. I think 90% of the confrontation we see in our world, especially right now, is self-serving confrontation. Let me prove my self-righteousness by confronting you.
Let me show you how smart I am.
Exactly.
Let me try to put you in your place and catch you, and then edit the videos and make you look really stupid. Speaking of editing and making people look smart, I've got some things I need you to edit in with Jared and change some things I've said.
A little exchange of money and we'll talk.
But it's that foundation of going, when Jesus calls the disciples to love, he's calling them to do it out of the fact that he just got on his hands and knees, having put on the clothes of a servant and washed their feet. By the way, while they were debating over who's the best, who's the greatest. Jesus wasn't washing their feet because they loved well enough. Right? Judas is at the table, so we know it's not because they loved well enough. But it wasn't just Judas. I think it's in Luke's account, if I'm remembering correctly, but after the upper room, they're walking along and arguing over who's the best, who's the greatest. And so Jesus just washed feet, and they're still arguing over who's the best. That's why none of them got up from the table to serve, because you don't prove your greatness, at least in the world's standard, by serving. You prove your greatness by being served. And so it's kind of like, who's going to wash my feet because I'm the best. And so Jesus isn't loving them, washing their feet, because they've finally gotten it together,
Yeah.
and they finally figured it out. He is showing them his love, knowing that Judas will betray him, Peter will deny him, the disciples will abandon him. He's loving them even though he's serving them, even though he knows they're still being self-serving. And it is in that love and out of that love that he says, all right, now this is how I want you to love. You love this way. Why? Because I loved you first this way. And it's only when I know that love that I can be set free from walking into a room and evaluating everybody else and competing and comparing, because now I've got the satisfaction. I'm satisfied. I have an identity because I know that I'm loved, not because of what I've done or what I do, but because he loves and he's chosen to love me and he calls me his own. And so now I can walk in the room, and instead of looking at people as a consumer, right, figuring out how to use people to get my identity, now I can walk in the room and go, how can I actually add to people's life? How can I serve them? What are the needs around me? How can I give into this moment? And not in order to try to kind of boost my self-esteem or anything else. I'm doing it out of a love that I have as an echo from his love that's being constantly poured out. And I'm going to be honest for myself, and I think we can all say this, but man, I'm going to spend my whole life learning how to rest in his love. And we can criticize the disciples for arguing over, I know I just kind of did, right?
Yeah, sure,
over who's the greatest, but yet at the same time to go, my goodness, how easy is it for us? And you get two pastors in the room, right? How easy is it for pastors to fall into a pattern where we're competing and comparing with other pastors in order to go, well, am I really somebody? Do I really matter? Am I significant? And am I, who's the greatest, right? It's such a, and it's like, so, and by the way, not just, I'm using pastors as an example, but for all of us, the only way to break out of that is to really know that I am loved and accepted, not on the basis of what I do, what I add, who I serve, but on Jesus and what he's done for me.
There's a little bit of grace in there too, seeing that the disciples who were with Jesus in the moment, present with him, spent years of time with him, were still arguing. Like it's that reminder that we're all human. Yeah.
And he still loves them and serves them and is patient with them, and how patient he is with us.
I guess the final question here as we wrap up is there a personal story that you can think of, or an illustration that maybe didn't make it into any of the sermons that really touched your heart as far as an example of God's love and loving others like him?
I was thinking of one story that made it in that probably was a bad example of God's love. And it was the Sunday that Jared preached here in Naperville. And he got up on stage and mocked my back issues. I was just thinking, that's just it was
just
poor.
For reference for those who want to go back and watch it. I think that was the third Sunday, right?
The third Sunday.
Third Sunday.
Yep.
You should probably watch Naperville and Plainfield, because when I was in Plainfield,
I looked back and I saw that you were so kind and you said all these nice things about me, and I was like, man, I feel like a big ol' doofus.
Man. Yeah, nice. No, I love it. I love it. It's so good.
Yeah.
It's so good. One story that, and I love the fact that we can joke around and laugh.
I hate it.
It really is so good. One story that, and I just thought of it right now, that I love to share in terms of the power of love, in terms of God's love in our lives and God's love through us into the lives of others. It would be my sister-in-law, who my in-laws went down to later in life, felt called onto the mission field and sold everything. They were chicken farmers, sold everything, went on the mission field down in Quito, Ecuador. And while they were there, my mother-in-law was serving at an orphanage. And there was a baby that was brought in who had been abandoned. She had Down syndrome, all sorts of complications, and she was dying. I mean, I think it was at 7 months she weighed 6 pounds, if I remember correctly. I mean, she was but you got to understand, this was like, oh man, she was 6 weeks old at the time, and she was dying. And they asked my in-laws if they would take her in to give her a loving place to die, which what a Like, yeah,
That's
cheapers.
hard.
Anyway, so they said yes. And they thought it's going to be a week, 2 weeks, and she'll be gone. And weeks turned into months turned into years. And, God ended up bringing them back to they're from Canada, back to Canada. She's in her mid-20s now.
Wow.
And, doctors said they said she'd never walk. She'd never talk. She would never get to go to school. She never, all of these things. She had, I think 70% of her esophagus was closed, could barely breathe. And she had a hole in her heart that they said would never heal. And, the hole in her heart is healed. She walks, she runs, she swims. Swimming is one of her favorite things to do. Mm-hmm. She talks. She doesn't use sign language. Her sign language for me is to stroke her beard, her chin, like she's stroking a beard, and say, "Dan." That's her sign language for me, which is awesome. She is so sweet, so caring. She's gone to school. She graduated. She has had jobs, and you look at that and you go, what happened? How did she go from she's going to die to having a full life? Yeah. And I really believe that God used the love of my in-laws. There's stories. There's scientific evidence of a failure to thrive because of a lack of love, right? Yep. If the baby isn't going to be held, that can be deadly, right? Not loved, not cared for. It's life-giving. And I think the love of that family, God used that to transform her life. And she knows Jesus. She's been baptized, and not just to transform her physical life, but her spiritual life. There's so many stories of people who have loved ones that they think it's hopeless, they'll never be changed. Yeah, cannot
I think
happen.
Of your story with your mother and when you were born.
Yeah, when my mom was pregnant with me. Yeah. In fact, I didn't grow for the first. My mom was very sick for the first 2 weeks early on in the pregnancy. She had an over 103 fever for about a week and a half, I think. And I didn't grow for the first 3 months. And every time she would go into the doctor's office, they were like, yeah, this baby is not growing. It's not going to survive. Even if it does, it will have all sorts of handicaps, limitations. And they constantly pressured her to get an abortion. Every time she went in, they said, "You got to abort this baby. Wow. It's not going to." And they just spent a lot of time praying. Yeah. Honestly, and they just said, "Look, whatever God wants for us, we're going to accept that. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. What we're going to accept whatever God has for us." And I started growing at 3 months, and they were like, "Look, we're telling you, even if the baby grows, it's just not going to be healthy, and most likely won't live more than a few hours when it's born." And so they said, "Look, we trust God. We're going to pray and trust what God can do in this situation." And lo and behold, they had a perfect child. Perfect. Yeah. Flawless. Flawless. But yeah, you see just how God can take seemingly impossible situations, and how His love can meet us in those places where we think it's hopeless. And look, as long as there's breath in our lungs, God's love can meet us and change people's lives, and He uses us in that process, which is what an amazing, unbelievable gift that God uses broken people to reflect His perfect love in this world. Yeah. So
I would write those doctors a letter every single year.
Yeah,
let's just be like, "Hey, so I'm still alive.
Here I am.
Yeah. Still here."
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks, guys. That was an awesome look back at last month and the topic of love and loving like Christ. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for sharing your thoughts, for sharing what didn't make it on the stage, so to speak. And the next podcast we'll do is going to be on wisdom. We're in the midst of that month right now, and I'm looking forward to hearing what wisdom you guys can share with us. And don't forget to take those side notes and bring those next time. So
Yeah, that's right.
we know what's missing that didn't make it to the stage.
There are
so.
lots of side notes when it comes to trying to grasp the wisdom of Jesus. 4 weeks is not enough.
Not enough.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan.
Yes, thank you, Dan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for listening to the GP podcast. Again, next month we'll be talking about wisdom, God's wisdom, and we hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully you were able to glean some wisdom and about love this time, and we will check in and talk with you next time.